Welcome to True Echo, where real stories echo louder than fiction. Here we bring you jaw-dropping tales of injustice, resilience, and unexpected redemption, crafted to make you feel, think, and remember. In today's story, one woman's quiet power shakes an entire system. You won't believe what happens when a flight attendant crosses the line with the wrong passenger, because the woman she tried to humiliate owns everything. Stay until the end. It's not just a slap, it's a seismic lesson in respect. The morning light in Santa Monica painted the private airfield gold, a calm hush lingering before the noise of takeoff stirred the day awake. Danielle Covington stepped onto the tarmac with a stillness that was almost regal. Her blue blazer fluttered slightly in the breeze, a simple yet sharp contrast against the gleaming fuselage of the Gulfstream G700 waiting for her like a crown jewel. The salty tang of the Pacific hung in the air, mixed with the unmistakable scent of jet fuel and possibility. To the outside world, Danielle didn't look like a billionaire. No entourage. No flashy heels. Just a well-cut blazer, fitted jeans, and modest flats. Her hair was coiled neatly in a twist bun, her face makeup-free but radiant with purpose. That's how she liked it. Understated. Powerful. Unreadable. She ascended the steps of her jet slowly, her heels tapping rhythmically on the metal stairwell. Inside the cabin the air was still. Polished mahogany, cream leather seats, gold-finished accents, all waiting in silent luxury. Danielle placed her carry-on bag by her favorite seat, second row right side. She shrugged off her blazer and draped it neatly over the armrest, then sat down with the air of someone who had done this 1,000 times. This was her sanctuary. Her aircraft. Her creation. Covington Aviation wasn't just a company, it was her legacy. Built from alone, grit, and 17-hour workdays, it now operated elite flights across the country. The G700 was her flagship, a jet she'd personally designed down to the stitching on the leather headrests. Today's flight to Dallas was a routine one. A quick board meeting, a few face-to-face conversations, and she'd be back in LA by dinner. Her assistant had booked the manifest. Her pilot, Captain Gates, was someone she trusted like family. It was all set. She glanced at her watch. Early as always. That precious pocket of quiet before the world demanded everything. But then it began. A sharp voice, nasal, clipped, and jarring, sliced through the serene cabin. "Excuse me. Who are you and what are you doing here?" Danielle turned her head slowly, her calm expression not flinching. A woman was marching down the aisle toward her. Late 30s, white, blonde hair pulled into a severe bun that looked more like a helmet than a style. Her name tag read Melinda. Her eyes scanned Danielle like a security scanner. Only instead of metal, they were searching for something that confirmed their suspicions. Danielle offered a polite smile, her tone even. "I'm supposed to be here." Melinda didn't soften. Her arms crossed tightly, the disapproval practically vibrating off her body. "And who exactly said you could board this aircraft?" Danielle blinked. Was this really happening? "I own the plane," she replied calmly. Melinda laughed. Not a polite chuckle, an actual bark of disbelief. "Yeah, sure you do," she scoffed. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to leave right now." Danielle didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She just stared at the woman in front of her like she was trying to decide whether this was a prank or something more insidious. "I'm Danielle Covington. I own Covington Aviation. This is my jet." The words didn't seem to register. Or worse, they were simply ignored. Melinda's face twisted further. "You need to leave," she said again, her voice rising, sharper, slicing through the cabin like a broken fan blade. Danielle felt heat stir beneath her ribs. Anger. Not loud, messy anger, but the kind that runs cold and razor clean. But still she didn't react. Not visibly. That was her strength. She didn't lose her cool. Not in boardrooms. Not in press conferences. Not even now. She took a step forward, voice low. "Get the captain." But Melinda didn't let her finish. With a sudden burst of fury, she raised her hand and slapped Danielle across the face. The sound cracked through the cabin. Shocking. Brutal. Echoing off the leather and would like a gunshot. Danielle didn't flinch. She didn't stumble. She brought one hand slowly to her cheek, the heat blooming instantly beneath her skin. Her eyes never left Melinda's. If looks could kill, Melinda would have been reduced to ash. Behind them, the hum of engines stirred as passengers began to board. Bags in hand, sunglasses on faces. A man in a Patagonia vest froze mid-step. A woman in Louboutin heels gasped, instinctively pulling her young son behind her. A coffee cup dropped to the carpet with a dull thud. Steam began to rise into the air. And silence fell like a curtain. Danielle let it hang. That heavy, unbearable silence. Her cheek stung, but she didn't rub it. She wouldn't give Melinda that moment. She calmly bent down, picked up her blazer, brushed an invisible speck from it, and slid it back over her shoulders. Melinda looked frozen, her face drained of all color, her hands trembling. But still she clung to the delusion. "I'm calling security," she stammered, yanking a radio from her waistband. Danielle, with the patience of a saint and the steel of a general, nodded. "Please," she said. "Do call them." Passengers stood awkwardly near the cabin entrance, unsure whether to sit or flee. No one dared say a word. The atmosphere crackled with tension. Then, from the cockpit, a tall man with dark skin and silver at his temples appeared. He scanned the cabin quickly. When he saw Danielle, his brow creased in concern. "Miss Covington," he said loud and clear. "Is everything all right?" Melinda spun to him, her voice cracking. "She says she owns the plane." Captain Gates didn't even hesitate. He stepped forward and turned to Melinda with an expression so sharp it could cut steel. "She does." Melinda's mouth dropped open. Her fingers twitched around the radio like she might drop it. Danielle didn't say anything. Not yet. She let it land. The recognition. The horror. The mistake finally taking root. "I don't just own the plane," she said at last, her voice like silk over a blade. "I own the company. Every aircraft. Every uniform. Every seat. Including the one you just tried to eject me from." And with that, Melinda's world started to collapse. Melinda stood motionless, her mouth slightly ajar, her fingers still clutching the radio like it might somehow reverse what had just happened. But no words came out. She looked from Danielle to Captain Gates, back to the passengers now slowly settling into their seats with quiet, stunned expressions, all of them watching. Danielle adjusted the collar of her blazer with deliberate grace and stepped toward the captain, her tone soft but charged with authority. "Captain Gates, I believe we need to address a serious breach in protocol." "Yes, ma'am," he replied without missing a beat. His eyes locked on Melinda, and the weight of his disappointment was heavier than any punishment. "We'll take care of this immediately." But Danielle raised a hand. "Not yet," she said, her voice calm, decisive. "She'll stay." The captain paused, visibly surprised. Melinda's lips parted as if to object, but no sound came. Danielle turned back toward her, slowly, not with rage but with something far more devastating, poise. "You're going to serve me," she said, her voice like steel dipped in honey. "With respect. With care. Just as you would any other passenger. Let's see if you're capable of learning something today." Melinda looked like she had been sucker-punched by gravity. Her shoulders slumped slightly, her face flushing a deep red that began at her throat and crept up to her cheeks. She looked down, nodding once, stiffly. Danielle turned and walked to her seat without another word. She didn't need to say more. The lesson had already begun and everyone aboard knew it. The entire cabin felt like it was holding its breath. Melinda took one slow, reluctant step back toward the galley, her movements robotic, her face pale. The rest of the boarding process dragged on with an awkward silence, every new passenger casting glances at Danielle and Melinda, whispering behind hands, raising brows. Some recognized Danielle now, her face, her name, the empire she had built from nothing. Others just knew they had witnessed something significant, something powerful, and they were still processing it. As the jet taxied toward the runway, Danielle stared out the window, unmoved. Her cheeks still bore the faint pink bloom of the slap, but her expression betrayed nothing. No pain. No anger. Just quiet, commanding presence. 30,000 feet above ground, the aircraft cruised smoothly. Conversations were hushed, phones flicked on and off, drinks were requested in tentative voices. Every eye followed Melinda when she moved, her name whispered behind seatbacks like the ghost of a cautionary tale in the making. 2 hours into the flight, Melinda approached Danielle's seat with cautious steps, hands smoothing her already creased uniform. She cleared her throat. "Would you like something to drink, ma'am?" she asked, barely louder than a whisper. Danielle turned her head slowly. Her eyes scanned the woman in front of her, not with malice, but with a precision that felt surgical. "Water," she said. "Room temperature. No ice." "Of course," Melinda said quickly, nearly tripping as she spun around to retrieve it. When she returned, she placed the glass with both hands, careful not to spill a drop. Danielle looked at it, then up at her. "Thank you," she said. 2 simple words, but they landed with the weight of a verdict. Melinda nodded, stepping back like a dismissed soldier. She didn't speak again. The flight continued in strange, reverent quiet. Outside, clouds stretched like cotton across a blue canvas. Inside, passengers wrestled with their own discomfort, some questioning their own assumptions, others marveling at Danielle's unshaken grace. She had turned an insult into a lesson, humiliation into authority, without ever needing to shout. But the reckoning wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. When the wheels touched down at Dallas Love Field, the plane coasted smoothly across the private terminal's runway. The sun had risen higher, casting sharp lines of light through the windows. Danielle didn't rush to stand. She waited, observed, let the silence linger. Captain Gates's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dallas. Thank you for flying with Covington Aviation. Even his tone had shifted, measured, heavy with the gravity of what had unfolded midair. As the passengers began to collect their belongings, a new presence appeared at the front of the plane. A man in a navy suit and dark sunglasses, his badge clipped to his breast pocket, Covington Corporate Oversight. His posture was precise, face unreadable. Melinda spotted him the instant he stepped on board. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. Her hands twitched at her waist. She pulled at her apron strings, her fingers fumbling. Her breathing quickened. The panic was visible now. She knew. She knew it had been reported. That it was no longer just about one slap. It was about judgment. Image. The culture of an entire brand. A scandal at 30,000 feet that could bleed into the press by sunset. Danielle didn't move. She waited until every other passenger had disembarked. She stood slowly, brushed a faint wrinkle from her pants, and walked to the front where Melinda and the suited man waited. Melinda looked like she might crumble. Her lips parted. Maybe to beg. Maybe to explain. But Danielle wasn't interested in any of it. People forget what you said, Danielle began, her voice low but certain. They'll even forget what you did. But they never forget how you made them feel. Melinda swallowed hard, her eyes glassy. Danielle took another step forward. You made me feel invisible, she continued. Like I didn't belong in a space I built with my own hands. Like I had to prove my worth just to sit down. Her tone never rose. It didn't have to. Her words carved deeper than any scream. The suited man didn't speak. He didn't have to. He just stood there, witness to the collapse of a career Melinda had sabotaged with her own hands. Danielle's final words were like a soft closing door. And that, she said, will cost you far more than this job. She didn't wait for a response. She turned, stepped off the plane into the Texas sunlight and never looked back. The Texas sun hit Danielle like a welcome embrace, warm, bright, unapologetically bold. She adjusted her sunglasses, exhaled slowly, and stepped off the aircraft with all the calm assurance of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she'd just done. Behind her, the private jet loomed like a silent witness, its sleek body now marked, forever, by a story no passenger would forget. As she crossed the tarmac, the sounds of airport life hummed around her, distant whirring turbines, rolling baggage carts, a passing helicopter slicing the air overhead. But none of it registered. Her mind was quiet, focused. This wasn't the first time she'd had to remind someone of her worth, and sadly, it wouldn't be the last. Her town car was already waiting, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows. The driver, a statuesque black woman in a sharp navy suit, stepped forward and opened the door with a respectful nod. Danielle handed off her bag without a word and slid into the back seat, the door closing behind her with a soft, sealed click. As they pulled away from the airfield, Danielle leaned her head against the cool glass of the window. Her cheek still tingled faintly, a quiet echo of the slap. But that wasn't what lingered. What lingered was the quiet pain of being underestimated. Again. Even now, with billion-dollar contracts, a fortune cover, and an empire bearing her name, people still saw what they wanted to see. A woman, a black woman, alone, dressed plainly. Not a titan. Not a leader. Just someone to move aside. She wasn't sad about it. Not anymore. She was tired. Tired of having to constantly walk into rooms ready to prove that her presence wasn't a mistake. That she hadn't stumbled into power by accident. That she wasn't just lucky. Her driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror. You good, ma'am? Danielle smiled faintly. I'm good. But the truth was more complicated. The incident on the plane wasn't an isolated one. It was part of a pattern she'd seen her entire life. When she was 11 and her private school teacher called her articulate with surprise. When she was 16 and her summer internship boss assumed she was there for clerical help. When she was 29 and the board of directors suggested a white male CEO to represent the brand better, her brand. Each time it stung less, but only because she'd grown calluses in the places where it hurt the most. The drive into downtown Dallas passed in a blur of glass towers, shaded trees, honking horns, and fast-moving people. Her meeting wasn't until 2:30, but she always arrived early. Not just out of habit, but out of necessity. Being early meant controlling the room before others stepped inside. At 2 o'clock sharp, the car pulled up to the Covington Aviation Executive Suite, tucked into a skyscraper that pierced the clouds like it belonged there. She stepped out, nodded to the driver, and walked inside. Every head in the lobby turned. Her presence did that. Without announcement, without flair, she commanded the room. In the elevator, her phone buzzed. A text from her COO. Heard what happened. PR team is prepping a response if needed. You want to pursue legal? Danielle stared at the screen. She could. The slap alone was grounds for assault. The false accusations, the public humiliation? Her attorneys would have a field day. One call and Melinda's entire career, perhaps her life, could be unraveled in a week. But Danielle didn't reply. Not yet. When she stepped into the boardroom 15 minutes later, the conversation halted. 12 chairs. 11 white men. 1 Latina executive. All of them stood when she entered. None of them spoke until she sat. Danielle didn't say a word about the flight. She didn't need to. Because when you wield true power, the loudest message is the one you don't say out loud. The meeting ran smoothly, strategic forecasts, partnership reports, new sustainability initiatives. But Danielle's mind wandered. Not out of distraction but calculation. The Melindas of the world weren't isolated incidents, they were systemic. And if Danielle wanted to create real change, she couldn't just be reactive. She had to be foundational. After the meeting, she stayed behind, staring out at the Dallas skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The city looked like it was always building something, always under construction. It reminded her of herself, of how the work was never done. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Layla, her assistant, young, sharp, and fiercely loyal. "Ma'am," she said, "HR just pinged." The flight attendant submitted a formal apology. Written. "They're also requesting a video meeting with you to discuss her employment status." Danielle turned around, expression unreadable. "She submitted it voluntarily?" "Yes. It's thorough." Danielle hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Tell them I'll respond within 24 hours. And call marketing. I want a full internal audit of our employee sensitivity and bias training. Top to bottom." Layla raised an eyebrow but didn't question it. "Right away." As the door shut behind her, Danielle exhaled slowly. She wasn't just going to react. She was going to rebuild the rules. One policy. One plane. One assumption at a time. Because power didn't just sit in titles or ownership or bank accounts. It sat in the ability to shape the world that others had to live in. And Danielle Covington? She wasn't just building an airline. She was building a mirror. One that would reflect back at people like Melinda the truth they refused to see. That night, Danielle sat alone on the balcony of her Dallas penthouse, the city lights blinking like stars that had gotten too close. A glass of red wine rested in her hand, untouched. Below, cars moved through the streets in slow motion. Life, indifferent and oblivious, kept moving. But Danielle wasn't. Her cheek had faded to a dull pink now, nearly invisible. But her mind replayed the moment over and over again, not the slap itself but what came before it. The disbelief. The challenge. The refusal to see her. It wasn't rage she felt. Not anymore. It was resolve. Her phone buzzed again, cutting through the silence. A message from Layla. PR has drafted a response. Covington Aviation does not tolerate discriminatory behavior. The matter is under internal review. Want to approve? Danielle stared at it for a moment, then typed back. Not yet. We need to say something stronger. And personal. I'll write it myself. Because this wasn't just about one employee. It wasn't about optics or press statements or internet damage control. It was about culture. About the rot underneath the polish. The next morning, Danielle walked into the Covington HQ studio, used mostly for executive interviews and promotional videos. A soft-lit backdrop stood ready. A camera crew waited, unsure what this was for. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, and no designer labels, just a clean white blouse and black slacks. When the cameras rolled, she looked straight into the lens. My name is Danielle Covington. I'm the founder and CEO of Covington Aviation. And yesterday, I was mistaken for someone who didn't belong, on my own jet. She let that sentence hang. I wasn't wearing a power suit. I didn't arrive with a team of handlers. I didn't announce who I was. And for some people, that was all they needed to assume I was lying. Or worse, trespassing. Danielle's voice didn't tremble. If anything, it grew stronger with each word. What happened on that plane wasn't just disrespectful. It was revealing. Because even now, in 2025, a black woman can walk into a space she built and still be questioned at the door. She paused, then leaned slightly forward. But let me be clear, this isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility. At Covington Aviation, we hold ourselves to higher standards, not just of service but of decency. And that starts with me. She finished with a calm, unwavering stare. We are launching a company-wide initiative today. Mandatory inclusion training. Real accountability. Not just for the headlines, but for the people we serve. Because respect isn't earned by suits or titles. It's the baseline for being human. She held the gaze for one more beat, then said softly, "Thank you," and the video cut. The video dropped on all platforms by noon. By 5 p.m. it had gone viral. News outlets picked it up within the hour. Billionaire CEO schools her own employee after humiliating incident. Danielle Covington's quiet power shakes corporate America. Not just a slap, a statement. And perhaps most striking of all was the public reaction. Not just praise. Not just applause. Stories. Thousands of them. Flooding the comment sections. People from every walk of life. Pilots, nurses, janitors, students, sharing their own Melinda moments. Times when they'd been questioned, dismissed, erased. Danielle had cracked something open, and the echo was everywhere. But not everyone was celebrating. That evening, back at the airfield in Los Angeles, Melinda sat in a private conference room with a company rep and an HR officer. Her hands were clasped tight in her lap, her nails digging into her own skin. She'd watched the video too. And with every sentence, she felt the wall around her world buckle further. "I didn't mean to," she began, her voice brittle. "I didn't know." The HR rep didn't respond. He just slid a document across the table. Probationary agreement. Transfer offer. Mandatory training. Demotion. Final warning. Melinda's fingers hovered over it. She didn't sign right away. Because the truth, the one she was still fighting, was that she hadn't just made a mistake. She had revealed who she really was under pressure. And now she had to live with it. Back in Dallas, Danielle watched the reactions unfold quietly. She didn't post again. Didn't gloat. Didn't flame the fire. She just kept working. By the end of the week, Covington Aviation had launched an entire microsite for their new inclusion policies. Town halls were scheduled. Employee stories were being shared. Change wasn't happening overnight, but it was happening. And for the first time in a long time, Danielle felt like the empire she had built was starting to reflect not just her name, but her values. That Friday evening, she visited her childhood neighborhood in South Dallas, a modest row of homes and corner stores and cracked pavement that had once shaped her resilience. She walked past the old library, the basketball court, the diner that still sold $1.25 burgers. And as she passed a mural on a brick wall, an image of a black girl reaching toward a sky full of stars, she stopped. A group of kids were gathered nearby, huddled over a phone. "That's her," one of them said, pointing. "The lady from the video. The one who owns the whole airline." Danielle smiled, knelt beside them, and asked, "You all flying somewhere soon?" They laughed and shook their heads. One girl, maybe 10, said softly, "I want to fly a plane someday. But people like us don't really do that." Danielle looked at her, dead in the eye. "People like us?" she repeated, then smiled gently. "We build the planes now." The girl blinked, and something shifted. Something that no slap, no assumption, no prejudice could take away. Because power, real power, wasn't about proving anything to people who doubted you. It was about planting truth in the hearts of those coming after you so they wouldn't have to. The following Monday, the Covington Aviation boardroom felt different. It wasn't just the news buzz or the surge in stock price, or the press clamoring to get interviews with Danielle. It was the silence in the room before she spoke. A silence that said they saw her now, not just as a figurehead or founder, but as a force they couldn't ignore. Danielle stood at the head of the table, a digital screen behind her flashing the new company slogan, "Altitude meets attitude, redefining respect in the skies." She didn't need notes. She didn't need to pace. She just stood still, hands lightly resting on the table's edge. "You all saw what happened," she began. "And you saw how fast the world responded." A few board members nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "But let's not kid ourselves," she continued. "This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom. The real problem isn't a slap, it's the assumptions we've all grown comfortable with." No one interrupted her. Danielle clicked to the next slide. Employee demographic breakdowns, anonymous bias reports, exit interviews that painted a story none of them wanted to admit they'd ignored. For years we've prided ourselves on luxury, efficiency, innovation. But what about humanity? What about dignity? Her voice was calm, not accusing, but it was undeniable. From this day forward, no one steps into a Covington uniform without understanding who we are. What we stand for. Because this, she tapped the chart, isn't just a PR risk. It's a culture risk. And I won't lead a company that forgets who made it possible. She paused, then leaned slightly forward. Let me be clear. I don't care if someone books a $2,000 seat or a $200,000 charter. If they're disrespected by one of our staff, that's our failure. It was the kind of meeting that didn't end in applause. Just quiet realization. And when it was over, no one dared challenge her. Because Danielle wasn't asking. She was rebuilding. That afternoon, back in Los Angeles, Melinda stood at her new post, customer relations desk at the Covington terminal. A demotion, yes. But also a last chance. Gone was the pressed uniform of the Sky Crew. She now wore the gray blazer of terminal support. Her hair was no longer in the tight battle bun. It fell softer now, as if she had surrendered some invisible armor. People walked by, mostly ignoring her. Which felt familiar. Until one woman stopped. A business traveler. Black. Mid-30s. Confident. She approached the desk, glanced at Melinda's name tag and smiled knowingly. You're the one from the story, aren't you? Melinda stiffened. Yes, ma'am. The woman nodded. Good. Then after a pause, you still working here? Yes, ma'am. Well, the woman said, grabbing her boarding pass and sliding on sunglasses, guess that means someone gave you grace. Make sure you earn it. Melinda watched her walk away, the words ringing in her ears like a warning, and a gift. Back at the Dallas headquarters, Danielle sat in her office staring out the window at the clouds. She thought about grace. About power. About how easy it would have been to destroy Melinda in one swipe, with the same swiftness she had once dismissed Danielle. But what would that have changed? Danielle's assistant Layla knocked once before entering, a soft smile on her face. Ma'am, the Today Show called. They want an exclusive sit-down about what happened. And CNN's asking for a live interview. Danielle didn't look away from the window. Decline both. Layla blinked. Decline? Let the story live on its own, Danielle said. This isn't about fame. It's about reflection. Besides, if they didn't see me before, they don't get to shine a spotlight on me now like they discovered me. Layla nodded slowly. Understood. Danielle turned back toward her desk. Her calendar was packed. Quarterly reports. International expansion plans. A new aircraft unveiling in Dubai next month. Life as always was moving forward. But she paused before diving back in. Because this time something was different. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was fighting to be seen. She felt seen. Not because of a scandal. But because she had refused to shrink. Because she had stood her ground, in the cabin, in the boardroom, and in her own skin. And now, every single flight carrying the Covington Aviation logo felt like more than luxury. It felt like legacy. In the days that followed, the ripple effect became impossible to ignore. Passengers began sharing their own stories online. My Covington flight felt different. Like people cared. Like I wasn't invisible. One post read, I was treated like royalty and I only fly coach. Another simply said, thank you, Danielle. You made me feel like I belonged. The numbers followed. Bookings surged. Employee applications doubled. Other airlines began quietly updating their training manuals. But Danielle didn't gloat. She just worked. And late at night, when the city was quiet, she returned to that same balcony, wine still full, stars still blinking, and whispered a truth to herself that she'd carried since day one. Power isn't in proving them wrong. Power is in walking in your truth even when the world refuses to look. 3 weeks later, the slap was still being talked about. Not in tabloids. Not in gossip. But in classrooms, corporate trainings, HR webinars, and even sermons. What had begun as a moment of prejudice and ignorance aboard a luxury jet had transformed into a cultural reference point, a case study in power, identity, and quiet leadership. Danielle Covington had never wanted to be a symbol. She built Covington Aviation to change an industry, not to lead a social reckoning. But here she was, not just reshaping luxury travel but reshaping conversation. The unexpected fame had come with shadows too. That Monday morning, her publicist forwarded a media packet. Mentions of Danielle in over 300 news outlets, op-eds both praising and questioning her response, a trending TikTok hashtag Danielle did it right, and a clip of her statement video being shown in a high school ethics class. But one article stood out: when Black excellence refuses to apologize for its existence. Danielle read it slowly, absorbing each word as if it were a mirror. The writer, another Black woman, detailed her own journey of being overlooked, second-guessed, mistaken for the help in her own office. But the final line struck Danielle in the gut. Danielle didn't raise her voice, she raised the bar. And that's why the world had to listen. She leaned back in her chair, eyes closed. The weight of that truth rested on her like a warm blanket and a steel vest all at once. Her phone buzzed. Layla again. "Ma'am, your meeting with Chairman Forrester has been moved up." "He's in the building." Danielle arched an eyebrow. Chairman Peter Forrester, head of the Aviation Federation, a man whose opinion could shift policy, business, and investment. He'd never met with her directly before. Only sent representatives. Her being a Black woman in a white-dominated space had always earned her respect in public and suspicion in private. But now he wanted to talk. Danielle stood, grabbed her tablet, and walked to the executive conference room where he waited. Peter Forrester stood at the head of the table, impeccably dressed, his hair silver and swept, posture as crisp as the pinstripe suit he wore. He extended a hand. "Miss Covington." "Chairman," she said coolly, shaking it. "Please, Danielle is fine." They sat. "I'll get to the point," he said. "I saw the video. I followed the story. And I must say, it was handled with remarkable precision." Danielle gave a tight smile. "It wasn't scripted." "Precisely why it worked," he said. "You didn't just de-escalate a crisis. You demonstrated leadership. And frankly, vision." He paused. His tone shifted. "There's a seat opening on the Global Aviation Ethics Council. It's typically filled by, well, legacy members. But after some discussion your name came up." Danielle blinked. "That's unexpected." "It's overdue," he said simply. She didn't respond right away. Not out of disbelief, but because she had already known this moment would come. When the world couldn't ignore her anymore. "What would that entail?" she asked. "Influencing global standards. Setting new expectations. Shaping how our industry talks about bias, culture, even class perception." Danielle's fingers tapped the table lightly. "And if I accept?" "You'll be the first Black woman on the council," he said. "And the youngest member by at least 15 years. Danielle didn't smile. But something in her eyes glinted. Not for the title. But for the opening it created, for others. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. "We'd be lucky to have you." After he left, Danielle didn't go back to her office. She walked instead to the employee training wing where a class was underway. Through the glass she watched as Melinda, yes, that Melinda, stood beside an instructor speaking to a group of new hires. Her posture was straight. Her face focused. She didn't flinch when they asked hard questions. She answered them all. Danielle had quietly approved her reassignment, against the advice of half her board. "She's not who she was that day," she had said. "She can become someone better. If she's willing." And Melinda had been. In fact, she'd volunteered to co-lead the new Respect in the Skies onboarding course, mandatory for all Covington Aviation employees. When the class ended, Danielle opened the door. Melinda turned, surprised. "Miss Covington," she said. "No panic this time. No shame. Just a quiet acknowledgement." "You're doing good work," Danielle said. Melinda nodded. "I'm trying." Danielle walked over and handed her a slim envelope. "What's this?" Melinda asked. "A formal recommendation. For the Diversity and Inclusion Certification Program at Stanford," Danielle said. "If you complete it, I'll see about opening a new division, training leadership." Melinda stood still, the envelope trembling slightly in her hands. "You're giving me a second chance," she whispered. "No," Danielle said gently. "You're giving yourself one. I'm just making sure the door stays open." That night, the Covington jet touched down in Atlanta. Danielle stepped off with the same calm grace as always, heels tapping against the tarmac. But this time something was different. She wasn't just the CEO. She was the model. The lesson. The mirror. And as she walked through the private terminal, a ground crew worker, a young man in coveralls, paused, then said softly, "Thank you, Miss Covington." She stopped. Turned to him. "For what?" "For reminding them," he said, "that we belong here too." Danielle smiled. Just a little. Then walked on. The following week, Danielle stood beneath the soaring glass atrium of Covington Aviation's newly unveiled global headquarters in San Francisco, a stunning architectural tribute to transparency and elevation. Sunlight filtered through the angular skylights, casting luminous patterns across the marble floors where executives, engineers, pilots, and maintenance crews now mingled in the same space. No velvet ropes. No gold-plated nameplates separating rank from respect. The opening ceremony was modest, at her request. No fireworks, no celebrity appearances. Just a stage, a podium, and people. Her people. When Danielle stepped up to speak, a quiet fell over the crowd, the same reverent hush that had followed her since that flight. She didn't pull out a script. "I was once told," she began, "that power is the ability to make people move. But what they didn't say is that real power, the kind that lasts, is the ability to make people think." She let the silence breathe. "We built this company not just to get people from point A to point B," she continued, "but to challenge what flying should feel like. Who gets to feel worthy? Who gets to feel seen? That slap on my jet? It wasn't just about me. It was about every person who's ever been told by a look or a tone or a gesture that they didn't belong in the spaces they worked hard to reach." Her voice didn't rise. But it didn't have to. "Let me tell you something," she said, locking eyes with someone in the back. "You don't need $1 million suit to command a room. You don't need a title to demand dignity. And you sure as hell don't need to shrink just because someone else can't see past their assumptions." Applause swelled, not thunderous but long, steady, honest. As she stepped down, a Covington mechanic, white, mid-50s, grease still under his nails, walked up and shook her hand. "I've worked in aviation for 30 years, he said. "I've never seen someone like you at the top. You make it easier for the rest of us to speak up." Danielle smiled. That's the job. She didn't stay for the catered lunch. Instead, she slipped out the back with Layla and climbed into a quiet SUV bound for the airport. She had a surprise to pull off, and it wasn't on any official schedule. As the SUV weaved through traffic, Danielle scrolled through her messages. One from Captain Gates stood out. "Jet prepped and waiting. Crew briefed. You sure you don't want press coverage?" She replied simply, "No. This one's not for them." At the airstrip, a smaller Covington jet awaited, sleek, silver, quiet. The flight manifest had only 3 names on it. Danielle, Layla, and the young girl she had met weeks earlier by the mural in South Dallas, the one who had whispered, "People like us don't really fly planes." The girl's name was Zariah. Her mother had wept when Danielle extended the invitation. "You don't know what this will do for her," she said through tears. "She hasn't stopped talking about you since." As they boarded the jet, Zariah was silent, wide-eyed, clutching a small notebook filled with hand-drawn sketches of airplanes and cursive signatures trying to mimic Danielle's name. The captain greeted her like royalty, handing her a Covington Aviation pin engraved with "Future Pilot." Zariah didn't speak. She just nodded, eyes shining. Danielle let her sit in the co-pilot seat for takeoff. As the jet lifted above the Texas clouds, Zariah whispered, "I can feel it, in my stomach." Danielle chuckled. "That's just gravity letting go of you." Zariah looked back at her. "It feels like flying means something different now." Danielle nodded. "It always has." The short flight landed in Houston, where Zariah and her mother would attend the Covington Youth Leadership Gala as guests of honor. But to Zariah, the moment in the sky would be what lasted forever. As Danielle stepped back onto the tarmac, she knew she had finally closed the loop. What started as humiliation had turned into healing. What began as conflict had become culture shift. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't destroyed. She had chosen to lead. By the time Danielle returned to her office that evening, the sun had begun to sink behind the Golden Gate, painting the city in soft amber. She poured a glass of wine, not out of stress but celebration. This time it was different. She sat on the rooftop of her new HQ, feet kicked up, wind tugging at her curls, and stared out over a city that once wouldn't return her calls. And now they listened. Her phone buzzed again, Layla sending over the final metrics for the week. Flight demand up 42%. Employee satisfaction at an all-time high. Covington's training program being adopted by 3 other airlines. Oh, and one last note. Zariah wants to intern next summer. Only if I can work under Miss Covington. Danielle smiled. She typed back. "Tell her she already is." And as the lights of the city blinked on, Danielle leaned back and thought not about the slap, but the silence after. The moment she didn't flinch, didn't yell, didn't break, and by doing so taught the whole world what real power looks like. What you just witnessed wasn't just a story about a flight attendant and a CEO. It was about how the smallest act of disrespect can ignite a fire that lights the path for change. Danielle Covington didn't shout. She didn't retaliate. She stood firm. And in doing so, she redefined what leadership looks like in a world quick to judge and slow to reflect. This isn't just about one woman owning a plane. It's about owning your worth in spaces that weren't designed to see you. So the next time someone tries to write you off based on what you look like, what you wear, or where you come from, remember this. Real power doesn't raise its voice. It raises the standard. And sometimes the loudest message is delivered in silence. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently, subscribe to True Echo. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Has this ever happened to you or someone you know? Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded. Never shrink to fit someone else's small imagination.